John O'Naylor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Firstly, can I say that if my good friend and colleague, Mr Bishop, is around next time that the Lotto Powerball jackpot's to $44 million, I think I'll go down to the shop with him and let him choose the numbers, because for a Member of Parliament in their first term, within 2 years to get 2 bills drawn out of the ballot is very, very lucky. They say luck comes in threes. So as I say, next time Powerball jackpot's to $44 million, I'll be with Mr Bishop. We'll be down at the local lotto shop, and I'll certainly be lining up with him and letting him choose the numbers. That said, Mr Speaker, the things that he has actually put in have been very worthy. Last week we had the third reading of the financial support for organ donors bill, a great bill, and I just want to congratulate my colleague Mr Chris Bishop on actually getting that one through. And no sooner has that been dealt with than out comes the second bill, which is another very good bill which I'm happy to support. Mr Speaker, many of the speeches tonight have been focused, and the last speech in particular was very, very focused on one particular publication. It seemed to be very focused on whether or not one particular book was going to be in Mahurangi College's library or otherwise. But Mr Speaker, this bill is about far more than one book. It's actually about what goes on beyond that. So, Mr Speaker, the Films, Videos and Publications Classification Interim Restriction Orders Classification Amendment Bill, which is definitely a mouthful, and certainly that in itself, perhaps when we get to the Committee of the Whole House, we may want to debate a little and see if we can shorten that down a little bit so that perhaps it's not so much of a mouthful for us to say every time we refer to it. But Mr Speaker, I think addresses a very important aspect. And yes, there are some publications that do need to be dealt with in the way that the publication Into the River that's been talked about needs to be dealt with. But there is potential for this kind of thing to happen again. This is not just about that book. It is about actually ensuring that we actually have processes in the future available to the President of the Film and Literature Board of Review and to the High Court to empower them to actually make better decisions that will actually address issues in an appropriate way. So, Mr Speaker, for example, if I was to have made a film that I wanted to release, and the initial classification on that film was deemed as perhaps M, suitable for mature audiences. And my good friend, Mr Bennett, behind me, then came out and said, you know what, this is terrible. Clearly it should have been an R18 movie. Well, the only opportunity then that the President of the Film and Literature Board of Review then would have, while they were undertaking that, would be to simply take that film right out of circulation. Now, as someone who perhaps had made that film and had not necessarily decided for myself what audience that was intended for and was leaving that up to the censors, I would be actually financially impaired in terms of making some money off that. And even the person, if they were against it being classified as M, wished it to be R18, it would seem stupid and pointless for that film to actually then be taken completely off the market. And so the mechanism that is proposed by this bill, which will then allow the powers that be to in fact actually put in an interim classification of perhaps an R18 or an R20 or whatever it is that they might choose to do, Mr Speaker, at that point, that allows for a certain level of revenue to flow into the filmmaker. It will appease, in fact, the person who is wanting, who is appealing the decision and isn't happy with the way that it is being administered. It is appeasing them in the first instance. So everybody ultimately is a winner at this stage. So, Mr Speaker, I'm happily going to support this, not just at the first reading. I'm sure we'll get some interesting submissions through the Select Committee process. I look forward to hearing those submissions as it comes through the Justice and Electoral Select Committee. But I'm pretty confident that at the second and third reading, Mr Speaker, I'll be voting for this as well, because it's eminently sensible, it's practical, it's about getting good measures in place for good legislation going forward, and so I commend it to the House.